Hello, welcome to ESHA's webinar today on creating EU-compliant labels using the Genesis R&D Foods application. My name's Scott Hatzel, and I'll be your presenter today and showing you some of the basic functionalities on how to create these labels and optional settings that can be done on them. During this webinar, we'll cover some of the standard nutrition facts label settings, the new EU food regulations, some common label adjustments such as serving size, servings per container, voluntary nutrients, and then we'll have a Q&A session after this webinar that will address many of your questions. And if we don't get them all addressed there, we'll send out emails with not only the slide deck and information, links, and answers to your questions after within a day or so. This webinar is meant to be an overview of the functionalities of the EU labeling regulations, but we do have other webinars that are coming up. November 17th has one on reports, so this will give you an overview of how the customization of reports can be done inside of Genesis and the exporting and printing options. Then on December 8th, we have another webinar for creating Mexico-compliant nutrition facts labels, similar to what we're going through today for EU-compliant labels, but this will cover the specific regulations and settings for how to create a Mexico-compliant label. Additional webinars, as you can see below, can be found online, and these will include past, present, and these future webinars coming up, but any additional webinars we add. Thank you, and please keep coming back to learn how the different options inside of Genesis can help assist with your formulation and labeling needs. We also have training options available. So we do have an intro to training webinar, intro to training session coming up in Washington, D.C. in March, and this will cover more advanced settings for Genesis, intro settings to Genesis, and then we have an advanced training workshop for Genesis in Chicago in May, and this will be more of the advanced topics such as due diligence and documentation. If you have questions or would like to get on a waiting list or even ask for additional training options, please contact Carla. Her contact information is listed here, and she'd be glad to answer your questions or help get you in a training session. Some of the highlights of Genesis that to help you with your formulation and labeling needs. It was established in 1991 when the U.S. food regulations first became apparent. It can help with product development, menu analysis, nutrient analysis. There's a lot of reporting and audit features, and the main part of this is it helps with label and compliance for different country regulations, U.S., Canada, Mexico, and European Union. It also helps with allergen statements, ingredient statements, and other aspects to create a compliant label for these governing bodies. The database itself is comprised of over 60,000 items taken from more than 1,800 reputable sources, including USDA, manufacturers, restaurants, suggestions from our customers, and trends that we see in the industry. Currently, Genesis tracks over 163 nutritional components that can be expanded by yourself. It also encompasses My Plate food groups and diabetic exchanges, and we are continually updating the database for accuracy as well as compliancy. Let's get right into the Genesis application to show the label settings that we are discussing today for the EU module. In this particular illustration, I already have a formula created. This formula is called fruit and nut salad, and my components are listed and my percent of order are here. Wanted to show the label itself, so I'm clicking on the view label in the ribbon bar. I do want to note that previous versions of Genesis, if you are using them and have not upgraded to the 11.0 version, will have a different look than the newly released 11.0 version, which you're seeing here. So the settings might be a little bit different in yours, but you can contact ESHA sales to see about if you are current and or upgrading or needing to upgrade to get to the latest version and regulation enhancements. So with this selected, I am showing the EU label. I also have EU does require that the per 100 grams, the first column is displayed. The per portion side of this is optional, and Genesis gives you both ways to display this label. The mandatory nutrients will always be listed, which are energy, fat, saturates, carbohydrates, sugars, protein, salt are the mandatory nutrients that are listed. If you do have any vitamins listed, the percent RI must also be listed with the vitamins. I'm going to go through some of the settings that you'll see how I have the RIs turned on here. Additionally, the objects on the label display screen are very easily movable and exportable to not only within the application, just simply by left clicking and dragging and dropping, but also you can right click and export options very easily, or export the label and or options very easily to a file as an image or as text. There's also additional resources on our website for many of the additional layouts for not only the European Union but US, and you can find those under products on www.esha.com under Genesis Food Labeling, Labels, and EU will get specifically to the EU regulations. Now to get into some of the settings and how I can modify them. If you don't have in your particular version the EU module, you can contact sales@esha.com and ask to see about purchasing it to be added quickly to your label formats. To know if you have EU labels or other country-specific labels, I'm going to click on the label in the View title bar. Click on anywhere on this page. You can click on Settings, right-click Settings, and under the General tab, the first option is Regulations. And regulations, in my case, I have all of our label modules that ESHA currently has turned on. If they are dim lit, and you might not be able to tell that on my computer, but you would see that they're grayed out on yours, that it means it hasn't been purchased or updated in your particular application as of yet. And if needed, you can contact sales@esha.com and they will be glad to support and assist you in getting that governing body listed for you or updated for you. In our case, we're looking at European Union. I've selected European Union, which then gives me the format options for the European Union regulations. A couple of the different settings that you'll find in the EU options are per portion. In US, it's listed a little bit differently. In Europe, it's listed as per portion instead of per serving. You can expand this, type in the English name of how you want your serving size to be listed, which you'll see in the secondary column. I do want to note that the initial release of the EU module was based on UK regulations and has the ability to comply with McCann-Whittleson, or has the optional McCann-Whittleson database available at you. Other enhancements to the EU label module, such as additional languages, will be added at later updates. So back to proportion, you can change and modify what you want this to read. In my case, this is a text-only field, and I've typed in 1 serving equals 15 milliliters. There is optional French and Spanish that you'll see here, but they will not, at this point, display on the EU module. Additional options, and I just want to denote or spend a brief time on this, is under the EU drop-down area. This will be updated at later updates to contain more information, but if you do see this particular option here, it's basically related to the country specific on the numbering format of the label. So in our case, it defaults to English UK is the default setting that you want to have there. Under the same general label settings area, there is some format options that are specific to the label in general and also specific to EU. And if I were to scroll down and then expand EU if it's not already expanded, you can see some additional label settings that are EU specific. In this case, we have per 100 grams listed, but I could have shown this as per 100 milliliters, which would be the first column represented on our label. The of which statement, which denotes the saturates and sugars, or carbohydrates and fats, if you want to look at that way, can be expanded, and by check marking this option, you'll show or see the difference in how they are listed. In this case, I've turned off the of which statement, so the saturates and sugars are not indented with the of which statement. But to easily go back to that setting, I've right-clicked on the label, Settings, and under Format Options, go down to the of which statement, which basically says Show of which where allowed, which will be on those two primary nutrients. And then also you want to, or you can have the position of which statement beforehand. And this just basically shows the indent on where it might be at. So back to having it shown, of which is then shown on those particular nutrients. We're going to spend a lot of time in the settings because most of the label settings for not only EU but other label formats are done under the label settings area. Depending upon what we're looking at, there might be other options here. But back to the format options for European Union, there is a few other things. As indicated a little bit earlier, the secondary column, the proportion size, is optional, and you will find ways to add that proportion size listed here. So in my case, I have it checked, which you're seeing on screen. If I were to uncheck this particular primary or position column, you'll see that it removes. And I do want to note for those that are new users, I did not have to save any of these changes. Everything I do in a settings or nutritional setting on a recipe is done on the fly, so I can easily see what my label or formula might look like without actually having to save it to my database. So I'm going to go back and turn on the secondary column for portion size by check marking it and showing that value again. So easily see updated on the fly that you'll have that information there. There is some settings in here that are listed as global and some are recipe specific. A lot of what you're seeing here, you could say at the bottom, load settings or save settings, which are more of a global or user-specific option, but these will help with formatting. If you always want to have the proportions setting column listed, by setting that and say Save Settings, it'll come with that every time you use the EU label. There is also the RI value, and I touched base on it briefly in the opening remarks, but as you can see on my per 100 gram column, that the RI value I do have listed. And as you can see, there is an optional check mark for this. I'm going to turn it off for this example just to show that the RI value is only shown if there's vitamins and minerals, and it has to be shown for vitamins and minerals where it's optional for mandatory nutrients. So as you can see, it went back to the default regulation specific settings, and it only shows the RI values as required. If you did want the RI values listed for all nutrients within the label, we can go back to that format setting down to EU label or EU Union, and then check on the RI values to list them again. You can also have the RI values listed in the proportion secondary column of the label by just check marking this. Again, this is optional, but it is one of those things that for some of your label compliance or even your optional label settings or marketing material, you might want to have the RI value listed. I'm going to go back to the default settings for the RI values to show just what is required. Which you see here. And then going back to the settings to show, again, some more additional options that can be modified in here. A few of these other ones are basically as denoted here, align values in columns, which would not left indent them, but it would align them in the center of each column. By check marking that, you'll see quickly that it'll align the values in those particular columns according based on the information. As you can see under coppers, because it was longer and it didn't have the RI, or it does have the RI value listed, it's a little bit spread differently. So a lot of our users will go back through and just have the alignment done to the left as initially indicated. Inside of the European Union, there's also two requirements for the ingredient statements. or at least one main requirement, is that the ingredient statement is included within the nutrition facts label. As shown here, I have the ingredient statement listed in my nutrition facts label, whereas an example like US and Canada, the nutrition information is listed outside of the nutrition label and can be moved separately from where it is, as long as it's consistent on the back of the package. In Europe, you don't have that option. It is or needs to be listed inside of the nutrition label. And based on our formulation, I have my components listed in descending order based on weight. And one other option that you're seeing here is the bolded print denotes allergens that are also listed inside of the ingredient statement. So in my case, I have 2 items that are tree nuts and 1 item that's a soy allergen for the EU label. To make sure, and by default your setting might not, if you have European Union, have that listed, just make sure you check mark it, and then you can hit save settings, and this will always be saved within your label. There's also an option to show contains negligible amount statement. In my particular formula, I don't have any negligible amounts, refrain from that. I do have 2 nutrients that are negligible amounts listed, and that is biotin and potassium. And by displaying that, it is showing that negligible amount statement if I wanted to let them know particular nutrients that might be in there. Moving right along, there is the nutrient values. In European Union, there are some primary nutrients that must be displayed, and they are energy, fat, saturates, carbohydrates, sugars, protein, and salt. And they will always be displayed in the European Union label. And there is some optional settings that also comply with government regulations for European Union as well as other countries. And on the nutrient options tab, if I was to look at carbohydrates and expand, this is basically relating to the regulations and rounding and how I can set the different values of how I wanted them to be displayed. So by default, it's going to round to set to 0 if less than 0.5 grams, but you could change that to set to less than 0.5 grams if it's less than that 0.5 gram value, and it'll show you that less than signal on that. All of these are modifiable. Again, for total sugars, you have the regulations. You can click on each one. It's basically just the rounding options that you have here. There's also voluntary nutrients that can be displayed. And inside of the voluntary nutrients tab inside of Genesis, again, these are based on European Union voluntary nutrients because I have, back to my general setting, I have the European Union selected. My nutrients are going to comply with those regulations and what I can list. So in my case, I have biotin and copper as well as potassium listed on my label. And you can see that there is a copper value that is listed, which is shown in the upper portion of that, and it's required to have the RI value, whereas since I have negligible amounts of biotin and potassium, they are listed under the contains negligible amount statements. I can choose to display other additional nutrients under these voluntary if I wanted to have calcium, for example, or dietary fiber. As I say OK, those nutrients are then listed or updated based on where they would go inside of the label. So dietary fiber, put it in its proper order, whereas the calcium, because it's negligible amounts, was listed below. There is a lot of this pertains, if I was to click on the object properties, a lot of this pertains to just general settings on what can be displayed and or listed on a label. So you can easily get specific with the date that you're seeing up here, if it's shown, the font size that's available. And these are consistent through all modules, but I just wanted to touch base that they're still available inside of the Genesis EU module as well. The rest of these settings don't apply to the EU label regulations since they're not required. So from a standpoint of what you need to work with inside of the EU label, the first 4 tabs are really going to be your primary, and the 5th tab being an optional primary settings for what you might do in the label regulations itself. It seems like a couple questions have come into play, and I want to make sure that we're able to address all of your questions. I've kind of covered the general settings of what the EU label looks like and some of the optional settings that can be displayed, but let's make sure we get some of your questions addressed. So, looks like I have a question comes in. How to calculate and show kilojoules on the label? Well, for the EU requirements, kilojoules is always displayed on the label for energy. This is not an optional setting. You will always have the kilojoules displayed on the EU label. Let's see. Can I display trans fat and cholesterol on the EU label? Unlike in the US or Canada, they are not allowed to be displayed on the label. So even if you wanted to list trans fat and cholesterol, under EU labeling regulations as they currently stand, they cannot be declared. So there's no way to add those to the label itself. Let's see. Where can I find the EU food labeling regulations? Great question. It's a little bit longer, and I'll take you back to my browser here. And these, it's hard to denote the regulation link itself, but inside of the slides, we'll make sure that these are available to you, or inside of our follow-up email, we'll make sure the links are available to you. The easier way is to go under the European Commission, and you have to dig down a little bit deep, but if you go labeling and nutrition, food and labeling, you'll get this general page. And by clicking on the actual regulation number themselves, which is 1169-2011, will take you to this page, which then gives you the language and the format of what you wanted to download. This will be a downloaded file, which will give you the full labeling regulations. But again, we'll follow up with the link for you inside of our follow-up webinar template email. Let's see, is carbohydrates defined as the same on the EU and US labels? No, on the EU label, carbohydrates is available carbohydrates and doesn't include fiber, whereas it's optional settings inside of the US. And as you're seeing carbohydrates here, the calculation is based on that setting, and it's based on the available, again, not the fiber part of it. How is the nutrient salt determined? Genesis calculates the salt determined from the sodium value. So any sodium that you have within your formula itself, and if I was to look at the items, I've actually added sea salt into my formula, 100 grams of it. So that's being defined from any and all salts that are added based on all components as well as added ingredients. How are label calories determined? Let's see. The calculation considers calorie conversion from carbohydrates, protein, fiber, fat, alcohol, organic acid, sugar, alcohol, and then Genesis calculates this for you. So you don't have to know the calculation itself. All of that is available from within side of the Genesis application. That covers a few of our general questions that came up, but please feel free to keep asking your questions, and if we don't get to them today, we'll make sure that they are addressed inside of a follow-up email. In closing, I wanted to say that everyone who is registered will get a follow-up email with consideration to the questions, as well as information that's displayed here, slides, and links to additional websites. But if you do have questions that aren't addressed at that time, or you just have additional questions you want to ask, you can call the number that's on your screen. You can email sales@esha.com. The LinkedIn is there listed as well. And then if you did want to download a Genesis demo, this is the direct link for it, but you could go to esha.com, go to products, Genesis, and you'll see a demo download option there as well. And in that case, this concludes our webinar for creating EU compliant labels. Thank you for your time today, and looking forward to working with you for many years to come. Bye-bye.